The siege towers lumber toward the walls of Nishapur, but the figures pushing them aren't Mongol warriors. They're civilians from Otrar, the city that fell 3 months ago. Men, women, and children roped together and driven forward like cattle. Persian arrows rain down from the battlements, and the first volley cuts through the captives, dropping bodies that are simply trampled as more slaves are whipped forward to take their place. Behind this human wall, Mongol soldiers advance untouched, their own casualties nearly zero. It's 1221, and Genghis Khan has perfected a form of warfare that transforms conquered populations into weapons against the next city. The captives pushing the siege equipment know they're going to die. The defenders on the walls know they're killing their own people. And the Mongols know that this psychological horror breaks enemy morale faster than any amount of military force. This isn't random cruelty. This is calculated strategy that Genghis Khan has refined across 2 decades of conquest. Every city that falls provides the slaves needed to attack the next target. Craftsmen are separated and marched thousands of miles to build weapons in Mongolia. Young women are distributed among Mongol officers as property. The elderly and anyone deemed useless are executed immediately. And the able-bodied survivors become human shields, forced to die attacking walls so that Mongol soldiers don't have to. Even Khan's own generals, men who've slaughtered entire populations without hesitation, are disturbed by the efficiency of this system. It's one thing to kill an enemy in battle. It's another to systematically use their parents, siblings, and children as expendable ammunition in the next siege. But Genghis Khan doesn't care about his generals' discomfort. He's building the largest land empire in human history, and human life is just another resource to be exploited. If you think Genghis Khan built his empire through military genius and brilliant tactics, you're only seeing half the story. The Mongol war machine ran on the bodies of millions of slaves who were used up and discarded like arrows from a quiver. Here on Brutal History, we examine what conquest actually cost when an emperor decided human beings were weapons. Every view, every like, every subscription keeps the truth of Mongol brutality from being lost to the depths of forgotten history. To understand how Genghis Khan transformed slavery into a weapon of war, you need to see the man who rose from nothing to command the largest empire the world had ever known, and the brutal pragmatism that defined every conquest. Genghis Khan was born as Temujin around 1162 in the harsh steppes of Mongolia, into a world where survival meant constant warfare between nomadic tribes. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, respected enough to have enemies, but not powerful enough to protect himself from them. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father was poisoned by members of the rival Tatar tribe during what should have been a peaceful meal. The poison was probably hidden in fermented mare's milk, the traditional drink of hospitality on the steppes. Yesugei's death left Temujin's family vulnerable in ways that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. In Mongol society, a chieftain's family depended entirely on the loyalty of his followers, and that loyalty died with him. The clan that Yesugei had led, families who'd eaten at his fires and followed him in raids, simply abandoned his widow and children. They took the livestock, the horses, the felt tents, everything that made survival possible on the steppes. Temujin's mother, Hoelun, was left with 7 young children, no resources, and winter approaching. The family survived through desperate measures that Temujin would never forget. They dug for roots, caught fish in the rivers, hunted small game with makeshift weapons. Holun taught her children that the world owed them nothing, and that survival required absolute ruthlessness. When food was scarce, you took what you needed. When someone threatened your survival, you eliminated them. These weren't abstract lessons, they were daily realities. When Temujin was a teenager, he killed his own half-brother Bekta during an argument over food. The details vary in different accounts, but the core story is consistent. Bekta had taken fish or game that Temujin and his full brother Khasar had caught. Rather than share or negotiate, Temujin and Khasar hunted Bekta down and shot him with arrows. Their mother was horrified, but Temujin showed no remorse. Bekta had threatened the family's survival by taking their food. He had to die. It was that simple. This incident revealed something fundamental about Temujin's character that would define his entire career. He was capable of calculating cold-blooded violence without hesitation or regret when he decided it served his purposes. He wasn't sadistic or cruel for pleasure. He simply had no moral constraints that would prevent him from doing whatever he believed was necessary. Temujin's rise from outcast child to supreme ruler of the Mongol tribes took decades of warfare, strategic marriages, and the systematic elimination of rivals. He formed alliances with other outcast young men, building a personal following through demonstrated competence in raiding and warfare. Unlike traditional Mongol leaders who relied on clan loyalty and hereditary position, Temujin promoted men based purely on ability and loyalty to him personally. This created a military force bound by merit and personal devotion rather than tribal obligation. By 1206, after 2 decades of warfare across the steppes, Temujin had defeated or absorbed every rival Mongol tribe. The scattered clans that had fought each other for generations were united under a single leader for the first time in recorded history. At a great assembly called a Kurultai, the tribal chiefs and generals gathered to formally recognize Temujin as supreme ruler. They gave him a new title, Genghis Khan, meaning something close to universal ruler or oceanic ruler, a leader whose authority was as vast and absolute as the sea. Genghis Khan was 44 years old and controlled perhaps 1 million people scattered across the Mongolian steppes. By the standards of settled civilizations to the south and west, this was nothing. China's Jin dynasty alone had a population of over 50 million. The Islamic caliphates controlled territories stretching from Spain to India. But Genghis Khan looked at his unified Mongol tribes and saw not what they were, but what they could become, the most effective military force the world had ever seen. The Mongols were exceptional horsemen and archers, trained from childhood to ride and shoot in conditions that would have crippled armies from more temperate regions. A Mongol warrior could accurately shoot arrows while riding at full gallop, hitting targets behind or to the sides of his horse. Mongol horses, small and hardy, could survive on forage that would starve European war horses, allowing Mongol armies to campaign in regions where other forces would have been trapped by supply limitations. Every Mongol warrior brought multiple horses, allowing them to cover distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. But for all their mobility and archery skill, the Mongols faced a fundamental problem when Genghis Khan looked beyond the steppes toward the wealthy civilizations he intended to conquer. Those civilizations protected themselves with fortified cities, featuring stone walls 30 to 50 feet high, sometimes surrounded by moats, and defended by thousands of soldiers with crossbows, catapults, and intimate knowledge of defensive warfare. Traditional Mongol tactics, lightning cavalry raids and mobile archery, were useless against stone walls. You can't ride a horse up a wall or shoot arrows through 3 feet of masonry. Genghis Khan's early attempts at siege warfare failed miserably. When he first invaded the Jin dynasty in northern China in 1211, his armies swept through the countryside easily, destroying field armies and raiding supply lines. But when they reached the fortified cities, they were stymied. Mongol warriors had no experience with siege equipment, no knowledge of how to breach walls, and no patience for the months-long sieges that characterized medieval warfare. They would surround a city, realize they couldn't take it, and either abandon the siege or sit outside the walls, losing men to disease and starvation. These failures were unacceptable to Genghis Khan, and unlike many commanders who would have blamed their troops or circumstances, he recognized this as a knowledge problem that could be solved through ruthless pragmatism. He needed to learn siege warfare, and he was willing to do whatever it took to acquire that knowledge. The solution came during the conquest of northern China between 1211 and 1215. After capturing several smaller fortified towns through extended sieges, Genghis Khan noticed that his army's highest casualties came during the assault phase, when Mongol soldiers had to approach the walls under constant bombardment from arrows, stones, and boiling oil. Every assault cost dozens or hundreds of lives to soldiers climbing ladders or approaching with battering rams. The defenders had every advantage: height, protection, and preparation. Genghis Khan made a calculated decision that would define his approach to warfare for the rest of his life. After capturing a Chinese town, instead of massacring the population as he'd done before, he kept them alive. Specifically, he kept the able-bodied adults alive and organized them into work gangs. When his army moved on to attack the next fortified city, he drove these captives ahead of his siege equipment. The first time he employed this tactic, the results exceeded his expectations. The defenders on the walls of the targeted city watched thousands of Chinese civilians, people who might be their relatives, certainly their countrymen, being driven toward them by Mongol soldiers. The captives were roped together and forced to push siege towers and carry ladders. When the defenders rained arrows down on the approaching threat, those arrows struck Chinese civilians, not Mongol warriors. The psychological impact was devastating. Many defenders hesitated to shoot, horrified at killing their own people. Others shot anyway, but were demoralized by being forced to slaughter innocents to reach the Mongol soldiers protected behind them. The city fell with minimal Mongol casualties. Genghis Khan had discovered that conquered populations were more valuable alive than dead, at least temporarily. They were weapons that saved Mongol lives and broke enemy morale simultaneously. This realization transformed Mongol warfare. Over the next several years, as Genghis Khan continued his campaigns in China and then turned west toward Central Asia, the system became increasingly sophisticated and brutal. After every conquest, Mongol officers would organize the surviving population with ruthless efficiency, separating them into categories based on their utility to the Mongol war machine. Craftsmen were identified immediately and marked for preservation. Metal workers who could forge weapons and armor, siege engineers who understood catapults and trebuchets, carpenters who could build siege towers, and anyone else with specialized skills were invaluable to an army that had no tradition of such crafts. These skilled workers would be chained and marched back to Mongolia or to other Mongol-controlled territories, where they would spend the rest of their lives building the tools of conquest. The marches could cover thousands of miles and took months, with many dying along the way from exhaustion, starvation, or simple despair. Young women faced systematic selection based on age and appearance. After every major conquest, Mongol officers would go through the captured population and separate out women roughly between their teens and early 30s. These women weren't being selected for their skills or usefulness as laborers. They were being claimed as property, distributed among the Mongol army according to rank. Higher-ranking officers got first choice and could claim dozens of women from a single conquest. Common soldiers received fewer, sometimes just 1 or 2 women to be divided among small groups. This wasn't occasional opportunistic assault. It was systematized sexual slavery implemented as official policy after every single victory. The siege of Nishapur in April 1221 became the ultimate demonstration of Genghis Khan's slave warfare system and revealed the true scale of brutality when the Khan was personally motivated by revenge. The city, located in northeastern Persia, was one of the great centers of Islamic learning and culture, known for its poets, astronomers, and beautiful architecture. It had also killed Tokchar, Genghis Khan's son-in-law and a favored member of his family, during an earlier siege attempt when a defending archer shot him from the walls. Genghis Khan's response was explicit and methodical. He ordered that Nishapur be completely destroyed and its population annihilated as an example that would echo across continents. His daughter, Tokchar's widow, was given the honor of personally overseeing the city's destruction. She accepted with cold determination, having every intention of making Nishapur's fate so terrible that no other city would dare resist. The Mongol army that approached Nishapur in the spring of 1221 consisted of approximately 50,000 Mongol soldiers and an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 slaves. These slaves weren't Nishapur residents. They were the survivors of Otrar, Bukhara, Samarkand, and a dozen smaller cities that had already fallen during the Central Asian campaign. They'd been marched hundreds of miles, fed just enough to keep them functional, and now they would be used to destroy yet another city they had no connection to. The Mongol commanders organized the slaves into work gangs, each supervised by guards whose only job was to keep them moving forward, regardless of casualties. The siege began with the systematic filling of Nishapur's defensive moat, a deep trench dug around the city's walls, designed to prevent siege towers and battering rams from reaching the fortifications. Filling the moat traditionally required weeks of labor, as soldiers carried earth and stones, working under constant bombardment from defenders on the walls. Genghis Khan's method was faster and more brutal. Thousands of slaves were driven forward with baskets of earth, stones, and rubble. As they approached the moat, defenders on Nishapur's walls unleashed everything they had: arrows, stones from catapults, clay pots filled with burning oil. The first slaves to reach the moat were killed almost instantly, arrows punching through their bodies or burning oil setting them ablaze. They fell into the moat, and more slaves were driven forward to dump their baskets and die. The defenders faced an impossible psychological burden. Many of the slaves being driven toward them were from cities in the same region, speaking the same languages, possibly even people they knew. Some defenders recognized faces in the masses being used as human shields. The choice was stark: shoot at their own people to try to slow the Mongol advance, or hold fire and watch the moat fill until the walls could be breached. Either way, the slaves died, but the decision of whether to be their killers tormented the defenders. The moat-filling operation took 3 full days of continuous labor and death. Thousands of slaves perished in those 72 hours, their bodies becoming part of the fill itself. When a slave fell dead with a basket still in hand, 2 more would be forced forward to take his place. The guards driving them forward showed no mercy to those who hesitated or tried to retreat. Anyone who stopped moving was immediately killed, their body adding to the growing causeway across the moat. When the moat was finally filled, a bridge of earthen corpses connecting the plain to the city walls, the next phase began. Siege towers, massive wooden structures 3 or 4 stories tall, were pushed toward the walls. Again, slaves provided the labor, pushing from behind, while Mongol soldiers walked safely in their shadow. Again, defenders on the walls poured arrows and fire onto the approaching towers, and again, the slaves absorbed the casualties, while Mongol soldiers remained largely untouched. Women were clearly visible among these siege slaves, and their presence added another layer to the psychological warfare. Defenders could see women from fallen cities, mothers, daughters, sisters, being driven to their deaths to facilitate the destruction of yet another city. Some defenders broke down completely and couldn't shoot. Others hardened themselves and shot anyway, their hatred for the Mongols growing with every arrow they were forced to loose at innocents. After 10 days of siege, Nishapur's walls were breached. The Mongol army poured through the gaps, and what followed was systematic annihilation. Genghis Khan's orders were clear: kill everyone. No one was to be spared, not for slavery, not for ransom, not for any reason. Tokachar's widow personally supervised the massacre, ensuring her husband's death was avenged with interest. Contemporary Persian historians recorded the aftermath in detail that still horrifies centuries later. The heads of the dead were separated by category: men in one pile, women in another, children in a third, and stacked into pyramids. These pyramids of skulls, arranged with geometric precision, stood as monuments to Mongol vengeance. Persian sources claim 1.7 million people were killed at Nishapur, though modern historians consider this number inflated. Even conservative estimates suggest several 100,000 died, making it one of the worst massacres in human history. The city itself was systematically destroyed after the killing stopped. Buildings were demolished, irrigation canals were filled in, fields were salted to prevent future cultivation. Nishapur, which had been a jewel of Islamic civilization for centuries, was reduced to rubble so complete that travelers passing through years later could barely identify where the city had stood. This wasn't just conquest, it was erasure, a message that resisting Genghis Khan would result in not just death, but the complete obliteration of everything you'd built. But even at Nishapur, where the orders were total annihilation, the sorting process happened before the massacre began. In the initial hours after the walls fell, Mongol officers moved through the captured population looking for craftsmen and young women. A few hundred people were pulled aside: metal workers, engineers, women deemed attractive enough for the harems of high-ranking officers. These survivors were chained and added to the slave columns, while everyone else was executed. Even in an operation designed for complete destruction, the Mongol system found ways to extract value. The pattern repeated at every major conquest. At Merv, another great Persian city, the Mongols spent 4 days after the surrender organizing the population before the killing began. Craftsmen were identified and set aside. Young women were selected and separated. Then the systematic execution of the remaining population began, with estimates ranging from 700,000 to over 1 million dead. The craftsmen and women who'd been spared the massacre watched their families die, then were marched away to lives of slavery. The forced marches of enslaved craftsmen were nightmares that lasted months. Mongol armies moved quickly, covering 30 to 50 miles per day when campaigning. Slaves, shackled together in groups and given minimal food, were expected to keep pace. Those who fell behind from exhaustion or injury were killed on the spot rather than slow down the column. Those who tried to escape were tracked down by Mongol horsemen and publicly executed as examples to the others. Chinese chronicles from the period describe one specific march of captured engineers and metal workers being moved from northern China to Karakoram, the Mongol capital deep in Mongolia. The column numbered several thousand men at the start of the journey. The march took over 4 months, crossing mountains and deserts under guard. Less than half the slaves survived to reach their destination. The dead were left where they fell along the route, their bodies marking the path like mile markers. Those who survived found themselves in workshops where they would spend the rest of their lives building siege equipment, weapons and tools for future Mongol conquests. The workshops established in Mongolia and across the growing empire became permanent fixtures. Chinese engineers built catapults and trebuchets based on designs they'd known in their homeland. Persian craftsmen worked metal into armor and blades. Slaves who'd been architects in their former lives designed fortifications for Mongol cities. They were valuable property, treated somewhat better than the expendable siege slaves. But they were still slaves. They would never see their homes again, never be free, and their children born in captivity would grow up as property of the Mongol state. The sexual slavery operated on an even more systematic and widespread scale. After every major conquest, the distribution of women followed a rigid hierarchy. Genghis Khan himself got first choice, selecting dozens or sometimes hundreds of women from particularly wealthy or important cities. His sons and close relatives chose next. Then generals and commanders of thousands received their shares. Officers commanding hundreds got fewer. Common soldiers received the smallest portions, sometimes just 1 or 2 women shared among groups of 5 or 10 men. This wasn't some romantic arrangement of concubinage with protections and status. These were rape victims distributed as rewards for military service. The women had no choice, no protection, no legal standing. Resistance meant death, and not a quick death. Mongol officers were known to torture women who resisted as examples to others. Most women submitted to their fate simply to survive, bearing children to men who'd killed their families and destroyed their cities. The scale of sexual slavery was staggering. When Samarkand fell in 1220, The city's pre-conquest population was estimated between 200,000 and 300,000 people. After the massacre of male defenders and elderly residents deemed useless, approximately 30,000 craftsmen were selected for forced relocation, and roughly 20,000 young women were distributed among the Mongol army. This pattern repeated at every major urban center the Mongols conquered throughout Central Asia, Persia, China, and eventually Eastern Europe. Genghis Khan's personal accumulation of women throughout his conquests resulted in a legacy that's measurable through modern genetics. DNA studies conducted in the early 2000s identified a Y chromosome lineage that appears in roughly 16 million men alive today, representing about 0.5% of the world's male population. This genetic signature traces back to a single male ancestor living in Mongolia approximately 1,000 years ago, almost certainly Genghis Khan or one of his close male relatives. This genetic empire wasn't created through consensual relationships or even through traditional concubinage. It's the measurable result of systematic sexual slavery across territories spanning from Korea to Hungary. Every one of those 16 million descendants represents a line of women who had no choice, who were taken as property, who bore children to their captors. The genetic legacy is literally written in the DNA of millions of people alive today, a permanent reminder of the scale of sexual violence that built the Mongol Empire. Even some of Genghis Khan's closest commanders expressed concern about the slavery system, though their objections were pragmatic rather than moral. Generals Jaber and Subutai, two of Khan's most successful and trusted military leaders, reportedly questioned whether using captives as siege slaves on such a massive scale was strategically necessary. Their concern wasn't with the suffering involved. Both were ruthless commanders who'd personally overseen numerous massacres. They worried that word of the treatment was spreading faster than the Mongol army, making future conquests more difficult as cities chose suicidal resistance over surrender. Their fears proved at least partially justified. In several cases across the empire, cities did choose mass suicide over Mongol slavery. When the Mongol army approached some Central Asian cities, the defenders would slaughter their own families, burn their homes, and fight to the death rather than face the known horrors of Mongol capture. These desperate last stands usually ended the same way: total annihilation. But they demonstrated that the psychological warfare of the slavery system could sometimes backfire. Genghis Khan's response to these concerns was characteristically pragmatic. The system worked. Mongol casualties remained minimal, while conquered territories provided endless supplies of siege labor and skilled workers. From Khan's perspective, the slaves were a self-replenishing resource. Every conquest generated more slaves than were consumed in achieving it. The system was sustainable, efficient, and it allowed his relatively small Mongol population to conquer civilizations with populations dozens of times larger. The practice didn't end with Genghis Khan's death in 1227. His sons and grandsons continued the system as they expanded the empire further. When the Mongols invaded Eastern Europe in the 1240s, they brought the same tactics. Russian, Polish, and Hungarian captives were used as siege slaves against the next cities in line. When Mongol armies under Hulagu Khan destroyed Baghdad in 1258, ending the Islamic Golden Age, the pattern repeated. craftsmen enslaved and relocated, women distributed among the victors, able-bodied survivors used as tools of war. The total death toll of the Mongol conquests, combining massacres, warfare, and the deaths of millions used as slaves, is estimated between 30 and 40 million people. This represented roughly 10 to 11% of the entire world's population in the 13th century. To put that in perspective, World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, killed approximately 3% of the global population. The Mongol conquests were proportionally far more devastating, and much of that death came not from soldiers dying in battle, but from civilians being used as weapons and worked to death as slaves. Here on Brutal History, we don't celebrate Genghis Khan as a great unifier or brilliant strategist without acknowledging the true foundation of his empire. The Mongol war machine that conquered more territory than any empire in history ran on the systematic exploitation of human beings as expendable resources. The slaves who died filling moats with their bodies, the women who bore children to their captors, the craftsmen who died in chains on thousand-mile forced marches. These millions are the actual story of Mongol conquest, not the tales of cavalry charges and tactical brilliance. The steppes of Mongolia swallowed Genghis Khan's bones 8 centuries ago, but the slaves who built his empire with their bodies and their lives deserve to be remembered for what they truly were: victims of the most efficient system of human exploitation the medieval world had ever seen. Subscribe and refuse to let history's empire builders hide the mountains of bodies their conquests were built on.